Picture this. You are a 7-year-old girl playing with wooden dolls in the dusty courtyard of your village home. The morning sun filters through olive trees while your mother kneads bread inside, humming a lullaby that has been passed down through generations. Your father tends to the sheep in nearby fields, their bells creating a gentle melody that speaks of safety, of home, of a world where the most dangerous thing you might encounter is a bee sting or a scraped knee. Then you hear it, the thundering of hooves against cobblestone, growing louder with each heartbeat. Your mother's humming stops abruptly. The clay pitcher in her hands crashes to the floor, shattering like your world is about to shatter. Your father comes running from the fields, his face white as fresh snow, because everyone in your village knows exactly what those hoofbeats mean. The Sultan's collectors have arrived. You watch in frozen terror as Ottoman raiders dismount their horses, their silk robes pristine despite the long journey, their eyes scanning the gathered villagers with the cold calculation of merchants evaluating livestock at market. When one of them points directly at you, your small heart stops beating for what feels like an eternity. Your mother collapses to her knees, begging in a language they don't bother to understand, her tears mixing with the dust beneath her feet. Your father stands helpless, knowing that resistance means death for the entire family, that your life is already no longer your own. They tear you away from everything you have ever known with promises echoing in your ears. Promises that you will serve the great Sultan, that you will rise to prominence, that this abduction is somehow an honor. But as the cart rolls away from your village, all you can hear are your mother's sobs fading into the distance like a funeral song. You press your face against the wooden slats, watching your childhood disappear behind clouds of dust, not knowing that you will never see your family again, that the little girl playing with dolls has just died, even though her body continues to breathe. This wasn't an isolated tragedy. This was Tuesday morning in the Ottoman Empire, where the systematic destruction of young lives had become as routine as collecting taxes or maintaining roads. You, along with dozens of other children, have just become inventory in the largest, most sophisticated human trafficking operation in recorded history, a machine so efficient, so well organized, that it would make modern criminal enterprises look like amateur operations. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about one of history's most celebrated empires. Behind the magnificent architecture and strategic conquests lay something so horrifying that even contemporary observers struggle to document it fully. This isn't about isolated incidents or cultural misunderstandings. This is about institutional policies that turned human beings, specifically women and girls, into commodities in a marketplace of flesh that operated with the bureaucratic precision of a modern corporation. The Ottoman Empire didn't just tolerate this trade, they perfected it, regulated it, taxed every transaction, and created elaborate legal frameworks that transformed the systematic rape and enslavement of women into a cornerstone of imperial governance. The numbers alone should shock you into silence. In Constantinople, the beating heart of this empire, approximately 1/5 of the entire population consisted of slaves during the 16th and 17th centuries. But here's the detail that makes your blood run cold. The vast majority of these slaves were women and girls, some as young as 6 years old, torn from their families exactly as you have just been torn from yours. This is their story. This is your story. And by the time we're finished, you'll understand that the screams echoing through marble halls weren't the exception in the Ottoman Empire. They were the rule. The cart carrying you bounces violently over rutted roads, each jolt a reminder that you're moving further from everything you've ever known. But you're not alone in this nightmare. Huddled beside you are other children. A Greek boy, maybe 10 years old, who hasn't stopped crying since they took him from his fishing village. Twin sisters from Bulgaria who cling to each other like drowning sailors grasping driftwood. And dozens more whose stories mirror your own in their brutal simplicity. What you don't understand yet, what your 7-year-old mind cannot possibly comprehend, is that your capture wasn't random. It wasn't the result of opportunistic raiders grabbing whoever they could find. You were harvested, selected, processed through a procurement system so sophisticated and methodical that it would make modern military logistics officers weep with envy. The Ottoman Empire had transformed human acquisition into an exact science, Military campaigns weren't planned solely for territorial expansion. They were calculated operations designed to harvest specific types of people for predetermined purposes. Your tears, the Greek boys' sobs, the Bulgarian twins' terror, all of it was factored into strategic planning sessions where commanders would estimate how many children they could expect to capture from each region, accounting for seasonal patterns, resistance levels, and market demand back in Constantinople. The Crimean Tatars, those master practitioners of human hunting, had perfected what they called the harvest season. They timed their raids to coincide with agricultural cycles, when men would be working distant fields, leaving women and children vulnerable in their villages. Like farmers planning their crop rotation, these human traffickers studied weather patterns, planting schedules, and religious festivals to maximize their yield of human cargo. The precision was staggering. Raiders moved with military coordination, surrounding settlements before dawn and systematically separating their captives by age, appearance, and perceived value. Girls between 6 and 12 commanded premium prices because their minds could be molded from childhood to accept their fate. Teenagers were valued for immediate sexual exploitation and reproductive potential. Women over 30 faced the harshest treatment, often worked to death in domestic servitude, or sold to brothels where survival was measured in months rather than years. As your cart joins a larger caravan, you begin to see the true scope of this operation. Hundreds of other children, thousands of women, all moving in the same direction like tributaries flowing into a dark river. The older prisoners whisper stories that make your blood freeze, tales of previous journeys where pregnant women who gave birth during the march saw their infants killed immediately, their tiny bodies left for scavengers, while the mothers were forced to continue walking with chains cutting into infected wounds. The journey itself becomes a form of psychological conditioning. Your captors deliberately separate families, tearing apart the bonds that might provide emotional support during the horror ahead. They assign new names in languages you don't understand, forbid the use of your native tongue, and punish any display of grief with beatings so severe that other prisoners learn to grieve silently, their tears flowing inward where no one can see them. The supply routes feeding this human machine stretched across 3 continents like the tentacles of some monstrous creature. From the Caucasus Mountains came Circassian and Georgian girls, prized for their pale skin and delicate features. Eastern European raids provided Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian women whose blonde hair made them valuable commodities in Ottoman harems. The Western Mediterranean contributed Spanish and Italian captives taken during coastal raids that left entire communities empty of their female populations. African routes delivered different types of human cargo, creating a racial hierarchy that would determine every aspect of a woman's fate in Ottoman society. The empire had created detailed classifications that read like livestock catalogues. Ethiopian girls occupied a middle tier, while fully black African women were relegated to the lowest status, their lives considered so worthless that they could be worked to death without economic concern. The merchants who facilitated this trade operated within sophisticated professional hierarchies that would rival modern corporate structures. Those dealing in white slaves enjoyed higher social status, joined prestigious merchant guilds, and catered to wealthy clientele who paid premium prices for European women. These traders maintained detailed inventories describing their human merchandise by age, appearance, sexual experience, and specialized training. They offered warranties guaranteeing virginity, fertility, and docility, with customer service that included trial periods and return policies for unsatisfactory purchases. The logistics were breathtaking in their scope and efficiency. Ships specifically designed for human cargo transported thousands of women across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, their holds modified with shackles and partitions to maximize capacity while minimizing escape opportunities. Caravans like the one you're trapped in carried human cargo overland through established trafficking routes that connected Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Caucasus to Ottoman markets with the reliability of modern shipping networks. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this system was its complete integration with imperial governance. The Ottoman state didn't just permit this trade, they actively facilitated it through bureaucratic infrastructure that would impress modern administrators. Officials maintained meticulous records of every transaction, tracking women like inventory in a warehouse management system. They collected taxes on market stalls, inspection services, transportation permits, and ownership transfers, generating substantial revenue for imperial coffers while creating paper trails that documented centuries of systematic exploitation. As your caravan approaches the outskirts of Constantinople, you catch your first glimpse of the city that will become your prison. The minarets pierce the sky like accusatory fingers, while the massive dome of Hagia Sophia looms over a harbour filled with ships carrying more human cargo. What should inspire awe instead fills you with dread, because somehow, despite your age, you understand that this magnificent city represents not civilization's triumph, but its most spectacular failure. The other children around you have grown quiet, their earlier tears dried up or driven inward by exhaustion and shock. You're about to enter a marketplace where human flesh is bought and sold as casually as bread or cloth, where your body will be examined like livestock and your future determined by the sexual appetites of strangers. The harvest season has ended, and now it's time for market day. The smell hits you first as the caravan rolls through Constantinople's narrow streets, a mixture of spices, incense, and something else your 7-year-old mind can't identify, but that makes your stomach clench with instinctive dread. It's the smell of fear, sweat, and desperation that clings to places where human dignity goes to die. You're approaching the Avaret Pazarları, the female slave bazaar, and the sounds that drift through the morning air will haunt your dreams for whatever remains of your life. The market operates in broad daylight, not hidden in shadowy alleyways but functioning as openly as any other commercial district in the empire's capital. Turkish merchants haggle over prices while examining their human merchandise with the clinical detachment of horse traders evaluating bloodstock. European diplomats stroll through the stalls with curious fascination, documenting what they witness in letters that will shock their home courts, while somehow never prompting intervention to stop the horror unfolding before their eyes. As your cart reaches the market's entrance, you see them hundreds of women and girls arranged in rows like bolts of silk or sacks of grain. They sit on raised platforms, their eyes downcast. Bodies trembling not from cold, but from the knowledge that strangers are evaluating their most intimate qualities for purchase. The youngest among them, girls barely older than you, wear expressions of such profound bewilderment that it's clear their minds have retreated somewhere deep inside themselves, leaving only empty shells to endure what's happening to their bodies. The Ottoman state had transformed human trafficking into a regulated industry with the same attention to detail they applied to any other aspect of imperial commerce. Officials moved through the market collecting taxes on every transaction fees for stall, rental, inspection services, transportation permits, and ownership transfer documents. They maintained leather-bound ledgers recording each woman's origin, purchase price, and subsequent ownership changes with the meticulous precision of modern accounting systems. But it's the inspection process that reveals the true depths of systematic dehumanization embedded in this marketplace. Women are stripped completely naked and examined like livestock, their bodies probed and evaluated by potential buyers who discuss their sexual utility in clinical terms that reduce human beings to collections of body parts and perceived functions. Buyers check teeth to estimate age, examine breasts for signs of fertility, and test reflexes to ensure their purchases haven't been damaged during transport. The virginity examinations are conducted publicly, with medical officials serving as quality control inspectors who certify intact hymens to justify higher prices. Young girls who should be playing with dolls instead endure intimate violations by strangers while crowds of men evaluate their market value based on the findings. The cruelty isn't incidental, it's deliberately designed to break spirits and establish the absolute powerlessness that will define these women's entire future existence. The pricing structure reveals just how completely the empire had commodified female sexuality through racial hierarchies that determined every aspect of a woman's fate. The market operated with posted price lists as standardized as any other commercial enterprise. African slave girls designated for both domestic work and sexual use typically sold for between 1,500 and 2,500 aksi, while white slave girls commanded 3,000 aksi if intended for household service. but prices soared beyond 6,000 akçe for European women designated as concubines, with some exceptional specimens selling for as much as 88,000 akçe fortunes that could purchase entire estates. These weren't arbitrary numbers thrown out by individual sellers. They reflected careful market analysis conducted by merchant guilds who studied supply and demand patterns with the sophistication of modern commodities traders. Syrian girls with dark eyes and light brown skin occupied a middle tier, fetching premium prices for their exotic appeal to Ottoman buyers. Nubian girls were considered least desirable and relegated to the bottom tier. Their lives valued so cheaply that working them to death represented minimal economic loss. The merchants facilitating these transactions operated within professional hierarchies that would impress modern corporate executives. Those dealing in white slaves enjoyed elevated social status, joined prestigious trade associations, and maintained exclusive relationships with wealthy clientele who paid premium prices for European women. They published detailed catalogues describing their human inventory by physical attributes, sexual experience, and specialized training, offering services that included warranties on claimed virginity and money-back guarantees for customers dissatisfied with their purchases. Customer service extended to trial periods where buyers could test their human acquisitions before finalizing transactions. Return policies allowed unsatisfied customers to exchange women who failed to meet expectations. Some merchants specialized in broken-in slaves who had already been trained for sexual service, while others offered blank slates, very young girls who could be molded according to their new owner's specific preferences and perversions. The documentation process that followed each sale reveals how completely the Ottoman bureaucracy had integrated human trafficking into standard governmental operations. Buyers received official certificates listing their human acquisitions alongside furniture, livestock, and other possessions. These documents included detailed physical descriptions, sexual experience assessments, and intended use classifications that would guide how the women were treated in their new households. The state collected detailed statistics on these transactions, tracking regional supply patterns, price fluctuations, and demographic trends with the same attention they devoted to grain harvests or military recruitment. Provincial governors submitted regular reports on the human resources available in their territories, noting which populations might be harvested during future military campaigns. As you watch this bureaucratic machine process human misery with administrative efficiency, something dies inside you that you didn't even know existed. The little girl who played with dolls just days ago is witnessing the complete transformation of people into property through systems so normalized that participants discuss their transactions with the casual tone merchants might use when buying wool or spices. A well-dressed Ottoman official approaches your group, examining each child with the practiced eye of someone who has evaluated thousands of human beings for market potential. His hands are soft, manicured, bearing rings that probably cost more than your entire village earned in a year. When he reaches you, he lifts your chin with fingers that smell of rosewater and speaks to your captors in rapid Turkish that you don't understand but whose meaning becomes clear when money changes hands. You've been purchased before even reaching the auction block, selected for reasons that have nothing to do with your humanity and everything to do with calculations about your potential value as sexual property. The transaction takes less than 5 minutes, documented with papers that legally transform you from a human being into an object owned by a stranger, whose intentions you can only imagine with the growing horror of someone far too young to understand what awaits her. The Constantinople slave market will continue operating openly until the early 20th century, processing thousands of women and children annually through systems that turned human trafficking into a cornerstone of imperial economics. But for you, the market's future is irrelevant. Your own future has just been determined by a stranger's evaluation of your body's potential to provide sexual gratification, and nothing will ever be the same again. The heavy wooden doors slam shut behind you with a sound like thunder, sealing you inside, what the Ottomans call a harem, but what you will come to understand is actually an elaborately decorated prison. The walls around you shimmer with precious stones and silk tapestries that would bankrupt entire kingdoms, but their beauty cannot mask the smell that permeates every corner. The scent of fear, desperation, and something else your young mind struggles to identify, but that makes your skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. You are standing in the imperial harem of Topkapi Palace, where between 100 and over 1,000 women exist at any given time during the height of Ottoman power. But here's what the romanticized stories never mention. What the tourist guides will never tell visitors centuries later when these chambers become museum exhibits. The vast majority of these women will never see the Sultan. They exist as human furniture, living decorations whose sole purpose is maintaining the daily operations of a system designed to service the sexual appetites of imperial power. The popular imagination conjures images of pampered concubines lounging on silk cushions, fed grapes by devoted servants, living lives of leisure and luxury. The reality that greets you bears no resemblance to these fantasies. The living conditions are deliberately harsh, designed not to comfort, but to break spirits and establish absolute submission. Rooms are cramped. Unsanitary spaces where multiple women sleep on thin mattresses that offer no privacy and little comfort. The air is thick with the mingled sense of too many bodies confined in too little space, punctuated by the constant sound of muffled sobbing from women who have learned that loud grief brings punishment. The hierarchy within these walls operates with a cruelty that would make medieval torturers proud. At the top sit the sultanas and favoured consorts, women who have earned their positions by successfully navigating years of sexual competition and political manoeuvring. Below them stretch dozens of ranks and classifications, each with its own privileges and punishments, each designed to pit women against each other in desperate competition for scraps of attention that might elevate their status or merely ensure their survival. New arrivals like you are immediately stripped of everything that connected them to their former lives. They tear away your clothes, burn them in fires that consume the last physical remnants of your childhood, and replace them with silk garments that mark you as property of the imperial household. Your name disappears, replaced by something Turkish that rolls off their tongues but feels like poison in your mouth. Your Christian prayers are forbidden, replaced with Islamic recitations you're forced to memorize despite not understanding their meaning. The woman who approaches you moves with the predatory grace of someone who has learned to survive by becoming complicit in others' destruction. She introduces herself as the Kaya Kadun, the head of the women's quarters. Though her title matters less than the knowledge that glitters in her eyes, the terrible wisdom of someone who was once exactly where you are now, who learned to transform from victim into victimizer as the price of staying alive. "You are 7 years old," she says in accented but clear Turkish, though you don't yet understand the language. Her words will be translated later, burned into your memory through repetition and punishment. Young enough to forget your old life completely. Old enough to begin learning your new purpose. That purpose becomes clear through a training regimen that transforms traumatized children into polished instruments of male pleasure. You learn to walk with a swaying gait that emphasizes your developing body, to speak in soft tones that never challenge or contradict, to anticipate male desires before they're even expressed. You master the art of belly dancing, not as cultural expression but as sexual performance designed to arouse observers who view your movements with calculating eyes. The other skills they teach you read like a curriculum from Hell's own finishing school: poetry recitation, but only verses that celebrate male dominance and female submission. Musical instruments, but only songs that accompany sexual encounters. Languages, but only phrases that express compliance, desire, and gratitude for whatever treatment you receive. They call it education, but you begin to understand its systematic conditioning designed to erase every trace of the person you once were. The daily routine reveals the psychological torture embedded in every aspect of life within these walls. You wake before dawn to prayers in a language you're still learning, followed by communal baths where older women inspect your developing body and discuss your progress as if you can't hear every word. Meals are communal affairs where conversation is monitored and punished if it strays toward forbidden topics: your family, your homeland, your dreams of escape. The competitive atmosphere isn't accidental. It's deliberately fostered by the system's design, which pits women against each other for attention that might mean the difference between survival and destruction. You watch as friends become enemies overnight when one is selected for special favor while another is ignored. You see women sabotage each other's preparations, spread rumors designed to diminish rivals, and betray confidences that might have been shared in moments of vulnerability. The selection process itself becomes a form of ritualized humiliation that happens with terrifying regularity. Palace officials arrive without warning, examining the women like buyers at a livestock auction. They check skin for blemishes, teeth for health, bodies for signs of disease or pregnancy. Those chosen disappear behind doors you're forbidden to approach, returning hours or days later with expressions that have learned to show nothing at all. The most heartbreaking aspect is watching what happens to the women who age beyond their perceived usefulness, or who fail to please their masters in ways that remain mysterious to your young mind. They don't simply retire to comfortable quarters or receive pensions for their years of service. They vanish, sold to brothels where their survival is measured in months, abandoned on the streets of Constantinople to fend for themselves without skills or resources, or simply killed to make room for younger replacements arriving daily from the slave markets. Some try to resist, clinging to memories of their former lives, or refusing to participate in their own degradation. You witness their punishments with the wide-eyed horror of someone too young to understand what she's seeing, but old enough to recognize that the screams echoing through marble corridors represent futures you might face if you don't learn to submit completely. The woman in the cell next to yours, a Greek girl, maybe 15 years old, makes the mistake of praying in her native language one night. The punishment that follows becomes a lesson for everyone within hearing distance. They strip her naked and chain her in the courtyard, leaving her exposed to the elements and the mocking laughter of other women who have learned that survival requires abandoning those who threaten the system through resistance. She lasts 3 days before her spirit breaks completely. When they finally unchain her, she moves like a sleepwalker, responding to commands with mechanical precision but never again showing any sign of the person she once was. Her eyes have gone completely dead, leaving only a shell that performs whatever functions are demanded, while the soul retreats to somewhere so deep that it can never be reached again. This is what awaits those who resist. This is what becomes of women who refuse to participate in their own destruction. You are 7 years old, and you're learning lessons about power, survival, and the complete corruption of human dignity that most adults never have to confront. The beautiful chambers around you hide horrors that would shock civilized society. But civilization has already looked the other way, choosing to admire the architecture while ignoring the screams that echo through its gilded halls. The woman who was once that Greek girl will teach you your next lessons about submission, compliance, and the terrible choices that await every woman trapped within these walls. The little girl who played with dolls in her village courtyard is disappearing more each day, replaced by something else. Something designed to serve purposes that your young mind cannot yet fully comprehend, but that your body is already being prepared to fulfill. The room where they teach you Islamic prayers is also where you learn the most chilling lesson of your captivity, that the system destroying your humanity operates not in defiance of law and religion, but with their explicit blessing. The imam who instructs you in Arabic recitations is the same man who will later provide religious justification for every horror you witness, transforming rape into righteousness and slavery into salvation through theological interpretations that corrupt the very foundations of divine teaching. The Ottoman legal system had created a moral universe so twisted that it defied human comprehension, yet operated with the precision of celestial clockwork. While free Muslim women enjoyed elaborate legal protections, their consent required for marriage, their property rights guaranteed, their honor defended through court systems that punished sexual assault with death, enslaved women like you existed in a legal vacuum where the same acts committed against you carried no penalty whatsoever. The contrast was not accidental oversight or bureaucratic inconsistency. It was deliberately designed social engineering that used sexual control to reinforce hierarchies of power throughout the empire. By protecting some women while abandoning others, the Ottoman state created a stark demonstration of freedom's value and enslavement's consequences that every person in the empire could understand at the most visceral level. A Muslim man could legally rape any female slave he owned, and the law would not only refuse to punish him, it would celebrate his actions as divinely sanctioned exercise of property rights. The only restriction, bizarrely, was that he could not force himself on slaves owned by his wife, creating a legal framework that treated women's bodies as assets to be shared or withheld based on ownership arrangements rather than individual consent or human dignity. The religious scholars who crafted these interpretations weren't ignorant barbarians working from primitive understanding. They were sophisticated theologians who produced detailed treatises explaining how the sexual exploitation of enslaved women served divine purposes. They argued that enslaving infidel women constituted religious duty, that using their bodies represented rewards for the faithful, and that resistance to these practices amounted to rebellion against God himself. These weren't academic theories debated in ivory towers. They shaped the daily reality of every woman trapped within the harem's walls. Religious authorities blessed the slave markets where you were purchased, sanctified the sexual exploitation that would define your existence, and provided spiritual cover for systematic brutalization that reduced human beings to collections of body parts designed for male pleasure. The imam teaching you Arabic prayers speaks with genuine conviction when he explains that your enslavement represents divine mercy, that you've been saved from the darkness of Christian ignorance and brought into the light of Islamic truth. His eyes shine with religious fervor as he describes how serving your Muslim masters will purify your soul and prepare you for paradise, though he never explains why this purification requires the destruction of everything that made you human. The theological framework supporting these horrors reveals how completely the empire had corrupted spiritual teachings to serve temporal power. Islamic scholars produced fatwas, religious legal opinions, stating that under certain circumstances, slave owners could kill their human property without fear of punishment in the afterlife. These weren't theoretical discussions but practical guidance for a society that had normalized the complete ownership and disposal of human beings. The children born from forced sexual encounters between masters and enslaved women were considered legitimate if acknowledged by their fathers, creating incentive systems that encouraged systematic rape by providing legal and social benefits to perpetrators. Women had no control over their own reproductive choices, no say in their children's fate, no legal recourse when their bodies were used as breeding stock to produce more slaves for imperial service. What made this system particularly insidious was how it corrupted natural human relationships at every level. Free Muslim women, rather than opposing the brutalization of their enslaved sisters, often participated in maintaining the system that protected their own status. They understood that their privileged position depended on the continued existence of a class of women who could be exploited without consequence. Wives would purchase female slaves to serve their households, knowing full well that their husbands would use these women sexually. Some even encouraged such arrangements, viewing enslaved women as convenient outlets for male desires that might otherwise threaten their own marriages. The system had turned women into accomplices in each other's exploitation, destroying the possibility of gender solidarity that might have challenged male dominance. The legal codes governing these arrangements read like instruction manuals for systematic dehumanization. They specified which types of sexual violence were permitted against which categories of enslaved women, established pricing guidelines for temporary sexual use, and created bureaucratic procedures for transferring ownership of human beings between households. The empire had reduced rape to a commercial transaction, regulated by law and blessed by religion. Court records from this period, preserved in Ottoman archives, document cases where enslaved women appealed for protection against particularly brutal treatment. The responses reveal the complete absence of legal recourse available to people reduced to property status. Judges dismissed complaints with explanations that masters had absolute rights over their human possessions, that interference with these rights would violate Islamic law, and that enslaved women should be grateful for whatever treatment they received. The parallel moral universe created by this system extended beyond individual relationships to shape imperial policy at the highest levels. Military campaigns were planned partly based on their human acquisition potential, with commanders calculating how many women they could expect to capture from each conquest. Diplomatic negotiations included discussions of tribute payments in human cargo, with specific regional populations designated as renewable resources for imperial consumption. The bureaucracy supporting these arrangements operated with the same attention to detail applied to any other aspect of governmental administration. Officials maintained detailed registries tracking enslaved women by origin, age, physical attributes, and sexual experience. They collected taxes on every aspect of the human trafficking industry, while creating paper trails that documented centuries of systematic exploitation with bureaucratic precision. What emerges from these records is not the portrait of a civilization occasionally tolerating unfortunate practices, but of an empire that had made human trafficking a cornerstone of social organization. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women wasn't a regrettable side effect of imperial expansion, it was a primary motivation for conquest, a reward system for military service, and a foundation of economic prosperity that shaped every aspect of Ottoman society. The theological justifications weren't afterthoughts added to excuse existing practices. They were integral components of an ideological framework that transformed brutality into virtue through religious interpretation. The empire had created a complete worldview where the systematic destruction of human dignity became not just permissible but mandatory for faithful Muslims seeking divine approval. As you kneel on the prayer carpet, forcing foreign words from your 7-year-old mouth while understanding none of their meaning, you're participating in your own spiritual destruction. The prayers you're learning to recite include gratitude for your enslavement, acceptance of your sexual exploitation, and requests for divine blessing on those who will use your body for their pleasure. The religion being forced upon you isn't offering salvation, it's providing theological cover for your damnation. The Imam watches your progress with satisfaction, noting how quickly you're learning to suppress your Christian identity and embrace Islamic submission. He records your spiritual development in reports that will determine your future assignments within the harem, evaluating your potential not for salvation but for sexual service. The prayers you master will become the soundtrack to your own destruction, repeated during moments of violation as proof of your grateful submission to divine will. This is how empires destroy souls, not through dramatic acts of violence, but through systematic corruption of everything sacred, transforming love into exploitation, religion into brutality, and human dignity into commercial transaction. The little girl who once prayed to a Christian god for protection is being taught to thank an Islamic one for her enslavement. And the most horrifying aspect is how completely normal this transformation appears to everyone around her. The year is 1864, and a new kind of horror is about to flood the Ottoman slave markets with such overwhelming supply that even hardened human traffickers will speak of it in hushed, amazed tones. The Circassian exodus begins not as a military campaign, but as an ethnic cleansing operation conducted by Russian forces determined to empty the Caucasus Mountains of their indigenous populations forever. Hundreds of thousands of Circassian people, men, women, and children are forced from their mountain homes at gunpoint, driven toward Ottoman territories with promises of sanctuary that will prove to be lies more devastating than any military defeat. They arrive at Black Sea ports carrying everything they own, desperate families clinging to each other as they board ships that will carry them not to safety, but to markets where human flesh has never been cheaper. What the Circassians don't understand, what they cannot possibly comprehend as they flee Russian persecution, is that they're not refugees seeking asylum, their inventory being delivered to the largest human trafficking operation in the world. The Ottoman Empire, which presents itself as their Muslim protector, views their desperate flight as a commercial windfall that will supply its slave markets with premium European stock at bargain prices. British observers in Constantinople document the horrifying arithmetic of this human catastrophe, with the clinical precision of commodity traders reporting market fluctuations. White human flesh has never been cheaper, writes one diplomat, noting that Circassian women who once commanded £100 sterling in slave markets are now selling for as little as £5. The supply has become so overwhelming that it's crashing prices across the entire human trafficking industry. But behind these commercial statistics lie individual stories of destruction that reveal the true scope of Ottoman systematic exploitation. Consider Safia, a 15-year-old Circassian girl whose journey from the mountains to the slave markets will illustrate how the empire transformed desperate refugees into sexual commodities with bureaucratic efficiency that would impress modern corporate managers. Safia's family owned land in the Caucasus highlands, where they grew barley and raised sheep, living in wooden houses that had sheltered their ancestors for generations. When Russian soldiers arrived with orders to evacuate all Circassians from the region, they gave her family 24 hours to abandon everything they couldn't carry. The alternative was death, delivered with the casual brutality that characterized Russian ethnic cleansing operations throughout the 19th century. The march to the coast becomes a death march, where families watch their elderly relatives collapse from exhaustion, their children succumb to disease, their pregnant women give birth on muddy roadsides, where infants die within hours of drawing their first breath. Safia's grandmother falls on the third day, and there's no time for burial, no ceremony to mark the end of a life. Only the terrible necessity of leaving her body for wild animals while the column continues its desperate shuffle toward the Black Sea. When they reach the ports, Ottoman officials are waiting with the practiced efficiency of livestock buyers evaluating a particularly promising shipment. They separate families with methodical precision, sorting people by age, gender, and physical condition into groups that will determine their fate in the empire's human processing system. Safia is torn from her parents' arms while they scream in languages the officials don't bother to understand, their desperation providing entertainment for bored bureaucrats who have processed thousands of similar scenes. The ship that carries Safia to Constantinople is specifically designed for human cargo. Its holds modified with shackles and partitions that maximize capacity while minimizing the possibility of resistance or escape. She's chained between two other Circassian girls, one barely 12 years old, the other perhaps 17, all of them understanding with growing horror that they're not passengers being transported to safety, they're merchandise being delivered to market. The conditions during the voyage reveal the complete dehumanization that defined every aspect of the Ottoman slave trade. Women and girls are packed into spaces barely large enough for lying down, given minimal food and water, denied basic sanitation facilities that create disease conditions so horrific that bodies are thrown overboard daily. The ship's crew treats their human cargo with less consideration than they would show livestock, because animals destined for market require care to maintain their value, while enslaved women are so abundant that individual deaths represent negligible economic loss. When Safia finally reaches the Constantinople slave market, she discovers that her refugee status provides no protection from the systematic exploitation that awaits all enslaved women regardless of how they arrived in Ottoman territory. The officials who process her intake examine her body with the clinical detachment of quality control inspectors, evaluating manufactured goods, recording her physical attributes, estimated age, and virginity status in ledgers that reduce human beings to inventory items. The market where she's displayed operates with the casual efficiency of any other commercial district in the imperial capital. Turkish merchants haggle over prices while examining their human merchandise, discussing Safia's sexual potential in terms that would be familiar to modern pornography consumers. European tourists stroll through the stalls with curious fascination, documenting what they witness in letters that will titillate readers back home, while never prompting intervention to stop the horror unfolding before their eyes. But Safia's story illustrates how the empire's systematic exploitation extended beyond individual suffering to encompass entire populations through bureaucratic mechanisms that transformed ethnic cleansing into commercial opportunity. Ottoman officials had anticipated the Circassian exodus months in advance, preparing market infrastructure to handle the massive influx of new slaves, while coordinating with military commanders to ensure optimal distribution of human resources throughout the empire. The pricing collapse that resulted from this supply surge reveals the purely economic calculations underlying Ottoman human trafficking operations. When Circassian women became too abundant, their market value plummeted below maintenance costs, leading to mass disposal through methods that ranged from abandonment to outright murder. The empire's careful market management had been overwhelmed by success, creating conditions where human life became literally worthless. The psychological impact on women like Sophia extended far beyond the physical abuse they endured during their enslavement. They had fled Russian persecution believing they would find sanctuary among fellow Muslims, only to discover that their supposed protectors viewed them as nothing more than particularly valuable commercial opportunities. The betrayal was complete, their families destroyed, their culture erased, their bodies commodified by the very people who claimed to share their faith. The Ottoman processing system that consumed Sophia and thousands of other Circassian women operated with the efficiency of modern assembly lines. New arrivals were sorted by physical attributes, assigned to training programs that prepared them for specific types of sexual service, and distributed to markets throughout the empire based on regional demand patterns. The bureaucracy maintained detailed records tracking each woman's origin, purchase price, and subsequent ownership changes with accounting precision that documented centuries of systematic exploitation. The children torn from their families during this process faced perhaps even worse fates than their mothers. Boys under 10 were enrolled in the Devshirme system that would transform them into Janissary soldiers through training programs that erased their original identities and rebuilt them as instruments of imperial power. Girls as young as 6 were placed in harem training facilities where they learned to serve sexual purposes before their bodies had even begun developing. The empire had created educational institutions dedicated to transforming traumatized refugee children into polished instruments of imperial pleasure and violence. These weren't schools in any recognizable sense, they were systematic conditioning facilities that used psychological manipulation, physical abuse, and sexual exploitation to produce human beings who would serve Ottoman interests while having no memory of any alternative existence. As Sophia disappears into this machinery of systematic dehumanization, her individual story becomes representative of hundreds of thousands of similar tragedies that unfolded throughout the Ottoman Empire's 6th century existence. She represents not just Circassian suffering, but the fate of women captured from every corner of 3 continents. Polish girls seized during military campaigns, Italian women taken during coastal raids, African children marched across deserts to supply imperial harems with fresh victims. The most chilling aspect of her story isn't the individual suffering she endures, but how completely normal her exploitation appears to everyone involved in processing her case. Ottoman officials document her enslavement with the same bureaucratic attention they apply to tax collection or military recruitment. Religious authorities bless her sexual exploitation as divinely sanctioned reward for faithful Muslims. Merchants evaluate her commercial potential with the expertise they might apply to any other valuable commodity. The Circassian exodus that destroyed Sophia's life represents just one chapter in a larger narrative of systematic exploitation that defined Ottoman civilization at its core. Behind the magnificent architecture and cultural achievements lay a foundation built on human suffering so vast and methodical that it challenges every assumption about progress, civilization, and moral development in human history. The empire that tourists admire today for its artistic legacy and architectural grandeur was sustained by the systematic destruction of millions of women whose individual stories have been erased from official histories, but whose suffering echoes through time as testimony to civilization's capacity for institutionalized evil. The last Ottoman slave market closes its doors in 1908, just 14 years before the empire itself collapses into the dustbin of history. Think about that date for a moment. While Europe celebrates the Belle Époque and America enters the progressive era, while the world marvels at electric lights and motor cars, while humanity congratulates itself on unprecedented moral advancement, the systematic buying and selling of women's bodies continues operating in broad daylight under the protection of imperial law. This wasn't ancient barbarism from a forgotten world. Your great-grandmother might have been alive when Ottoman officials were still collecting taxes on human trafficking, when religious authorities were still blessing the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, when bureaucrats were still maintaining meticulous records of children torn from their families and processed through systems designed to erase their humanity completely. The archives remain in the basement of Istanbul's state libraries, in the humidity-controlled vaults of Turkish historical societies, in the dusty storage rooms of former imperial palaces. Thousands of documents chronicle every aspect of this systematic horror. Ledgers recording the purchase prices of 7-year-old girls. Transportation manifests listing human cargo alongside spices and silk. Tax records documenting imperial revenue derived from the sale of women's bodies. Court proceedings dismissing complaints from enslaved mothers whose children were sold to different masters. These aren't fragments or rumors. They're comprehensive administrative records maintained with the same bureaucratic precision the Ottomans applied to any other aspect of imperial governance. Modern historians can trace individual women's journeys from capture to death through paper trails that reduce human lives to inventory management. The documentation exists because the empire was proud of its efficiency, viewing systematic exploitation as administrative achievement worthy of careful record-keeping. But here's what makes this legacy particularly haunting. The fundamental dynamics that enabled Ottoman human trafficking haven't disappeared. They've simply evolved into forms that allow modern society to maintain comfortable distance from their contemporary manifestations. The same economic forces that created markets for enslaved women continue operating today under different names and legal frameworks. Consider the striking parallels between Ottoman slave markets and modern human trafficking networks. Both systems rely on economic desperation to produce vulnerable populations. Both use sophisticated transportation networks to move human cargo across international borders. Both employ violence and psychological manipulation to maintain control over their victims. Both operate through corruption of legal and religious authorities who provide legitimacy to systematic exploitation. The Ottoman Empire's racial hierarchies that determined women's market value find their modern equivalent in trafficking operations that sought victims by nationality, age, and appearance to maximize profit margins. The bureaucratic infrastructure that processed enslaved women through imperial markets operates today through corporate structures that launder human trafficking proceeds through legitimate business channels. The religious justifications that transformed rape into righteousness have been replaced by economic theories that treat exploitation as market efficiency. The legal frameworks that denied enslaved women any recourse for abuse persist in immigration policies that criminalize trafficking victims while protecting those who profit from their exploitation. Most disturbingly, the social attitudes that allowed Ottoman society to ignore systematic brutalization while celebrating imperial achievements mirror contemporary responses to modern human trafficking. We admire technological progress and economic growth while remaining willfully blind to the human costs that sustain our prosperity. We debate policy solutions while avoiding confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that our lifestyle depends on others' suffering. The global economy that provides cheap goods to Western consumers relies on supply chains that include forced labor, child exploitation, and systematic abuse of vulnerable populations. The technology industry that connects us through social media operates platforms used by traffickers to identify and recruit victims. The financial systems that facilitate international commerce also enable money laundering operations that fund human trafficking networks. The Ottoman Empire's transformation of systematic rape into imperial policy finds its contemporary equivalent in industries that sexualize children, normalize exploitation, and treat women's bodies as commodities for male consumption. The same dehumanization that allowed Ottoman society to view enslaved women as property operates today through systems that reduce human beings to economic statistics or consumer demographics. What's most chilling about this historical continuity is how it reveals the persistence of moral blindness that enables systematic exploitation. The Ottoman officials who maintained slave market records weren't monsters. They were ordinary people who had learned to compartmentalize horror through bureaucratic routine. The merchants who trafficked human beings weren't sociopaths, they were businessmen, operating within accepted social norms. The religious authorities who blessed sexual exploitation weren't conscious evil. They were scholars who had convinced themselves that systematic brutalization served divine purposes. The general population that ignored screams from harem windows weren't inherently cruel, they were people who had learned to prioritize their own comfort over others' suffering. These same psychological mechanisms operate today, allowing contemporary society to function despite knowledge of systematic exploitation occurring within our own systems. We compartmentalize modern slavery through geographic distance, treating trafficking as a problem of other countries, rather than acknowledging its integration into global supply chains that touch every aspect of our daily lives. The little girl whose story began this exploration, torn from her village at age 7, processed through Ottoman slave markets, broken by systematic abuse designed to transform her into an instrument of imperial pleasure, represents millions of contemporary victims who continue suffering while the world celebrates progress and moral advancement. Her ghost walks through modern cities where human trafficking operates under different names but with the same fundamental dynamics. She haunts corporate boardrooms where executives make decisions that perpetuate exploitation while maintaining plausible deniability. She whispers in the darkness of suburban homes where consumers enjoy products created through supply chains they prefer not to examine too closely. The archives that document her suffering and the suffering of countless women like her serve as evidence not just of historical horror, but of humanity's capacity for systematic evil disguised as civilization. They remind us that progress isn't inevitable, that moral advancement requires constant vigilance, and that societies can normalize the most appalling cruelty through bureaucratic routine and ideological justification. The Ottoman Empire collapsed nearly a century ago, but the forces that enabled its systematic exploitation of women persist in forms adapted to contemporary conditions. The same economic pressures that drove imperial expansion continue operating through global capitalism. The same racial hierarchies that determined slave market prices continue shaping modern trafficking networks. The same psychological mechanisms that enabled social complicity continue allowing contemporary society to ignore systematic exploitation. The screams that once echoed through Ottoman harems have been replaced by silence maintained through geographical distance, legal complexity, and willful ignorance. But the suffering continues, hidden behind supply chains and corporate structures that maintain the same fundamental relationship between power and exploitation that defined imperial slavery systems. The most profound lesson from this history isn't about Ottoman cruelty, but about human capacity for normalizing systematic evil through institutional frameworks that transform brutalization into bureaucratic routine. Every society possesses the potential for creating systems that reduce human beings to commodities while maintaining facades of civilization and moral progress. The archives remain as testimony to this truth, preserved in climate-controlled vaults, where future historians will study how an empire sustained itself through the systematic destruction of human dignity, while producing magnificent architecture and celebrating cultural achievement. They document not just Ottoman crimes, but humanity's ongoing struggle with the forces that enable systematic exploitation across cultures and centuries. The little girl who began this story as a 7-year-old playing with dolls in her village courtyard died long ago, her individual suffering swallowed by historical time. But her story continues in every contemporary victim of human trafficking, in every child whose body becomes a commodity in global markets, in every woman whose humanity is erased by systems that treat exploitation as economic efficiency. Her legacy isn't just in the archives that document Ottoman systematic brutalization, but in the recognition that the same forces persist today under different names, requiring the same moral courage to confront and the same institutional commitment to prevent. The empire that consumed her life collapsed, but the machinery of systematic exploitation adapted and continues operating wherever human vulnerability meets institutional power, unconstrained by moral accountability. The tourist who admires Ottoman architecture today walks through spaces sustained by the systematic destruction of millions of women whose names were erased from official histories, but whose suffering echoes through time as testimony to civilization's darkest possibilities. Their ghosts inhabit every magnificent chamber, reminding us that beauty built on brutalization carries curses that outlast empires. The most important question isn't what we think about Ottoman crimes, but what we're doing about their contemporary equivalents. The archives exist not as historical curiosities, but as evidence that systematic exploitation can flourish under any institutional framework that prioritizes power over humanity. They serve as warnings that moral progress requires constant vigilance and that societies can normalize the most appalling cruelty through bureaucratic routine and ideological justification. The little girl whose story we followed from village courtyard to imperial harem represents not just historical suffering but ongoing tragedy that continues wherever human beings are treated as commodities rather than individuals deserving dignity and choice. Her voice joins millions of others across centuries, demanding that we remember their pain and learn from their examples to prevent similar systems from flourishing in our own time. The empire that destroyed her life is gone, but her story remains as testament to human resilience in the face of systematic brutalization and as challenge to contemporary society to confront the forces that continue enabling exploitation wherever vulnerability meets unconstrained power. The archives preserve her suffering not as entertainment, but as education, not as historical curiosity, but as moral instruction for generations tasked with preventing similar systems from emerging under different names in their own time.